Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you my latest wildlife drawing in pastels. Now this featured this absolutely stunning barn owl, and this is one that was requested on my Patreon channel. So the barn owl was one that came up a couple of times, so I knew that I definitely wanted to get it uploaded really soon. So what I decided to do for this, as always, is start off with the background first. Now I am using a mixture of my PanPastels and my Rembrandt soft pastel sticks. I'm applying that pigment with my oval shaped or round shaped soft tool. Both of those would work here. Now the reason why I like to use the round shape or the oval shape is because they have those curved edges at the tip. Means that you're less likely to get your harsh start and stop points when you're trying to get a smooth background like this. Once I built up my glow background and I got it really smooth, so it was a lovely transition from my dark blue closer to the barn owl and it faded into my lighter blues, I then added the snow. Now if you would like to see all of this tutorial in real time, I have it available now on my Patreon channel. It's over 22 hours of real-time footage, but for that reason, because it's a longer tutorial, I have split that up into 6 parts, but all 6 parts are available over there now. Because of how complex the feathers are on this bird, there are many different textures that I needed to get right. I decided to do this voiceover while I'm working so that there is absolutely, as much tips and techniques that I can give through every single detail that I draw. So this is also one that's going to be perfect to follow along to because it is so step by step. And as I say, I'm explaining everything at the time of drawing. On Patreon, you also get the reference photo, liner and full material list, so from every single pastel pencil colour that I have used and the PanPastel themselves, you'll be able to have all of those colours there available and follow along to this tutorial should you want to. So when it comes to working on the barn owl's face, I knew that I was going to be breaking this up into very small sections. Now if you've seen my other videos on YouTube, you'll know that that's how I work regardless of the subject. But because this barn owl has an awful lot of texture on the face and all of those feathers, I really did break it down into even smaller sections. At the moment, I put in my base layers with my PanPastels, but the crucial thing with that is I haven't gone too dark. I don't want the white feathers here to look really muddy in colour, so that would be my first tip. When you're working on something like this, where you do want those colours to be brighter and appear whiter, don't go too dark with those base layers. It's important to go dark enough, as you can see here, but they're not really dark. After that, it's just a matter of building up your layers from there. What's really crucial at that stage is to build up the feathers that are closest to the skin and then work up from there. You want to be ignoring all of those lighter feathers that you can see because they're sitting on top, so they need to be left till your very last layer. Now I have a video here on YouTube and it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur, so I'll link that in the description below if that's of interest. Now although we're drawing feathers here, all of the tips that I share in that fur video that I've mentioned just now, all the principles in that video are going to be the same. So you want to be focusing on your feather length, the feather thickness and the direction that they are travelling in. The way that those feathers are travelling and the way that they curve are all following the underlying bone and muscular structure. So we have to make sure that we get those feathers right. Now you're going to have a little bit more of a freedom of movement with the feathers in some areas. So for instance, above the beak where you've got what looks like a little mohawk between the eyes, that there is going to have more of a very random change in direction at times. But you'll notice that most of those feathers are travelling across to the middle of the face. So these little details are really important. If we get the feather direction wrong at the initial layers, it's just going to throw off the entire portrait and it can be a bit hard to fix once you start building up those details. Now if you realise that you have made some of the feathers or the fur, whatever it is that you're drawing, travel in the wrong direction, even if it is slightly, then you can just go ahead and make those alterations at the time. It will make the overall process far easier if you know that your fur direction is accurate from the beginning. So this section that I'm working on here, this was one of the most complex parts of the entire portrait. This doesn't, it's not a texture that we can complete in just an hour. It does really take time. But the biggest tip I can give anybody here, if you're focusing on something that's as complex as this, is break it up into those small sections and honestly just draw what you see. I know that sounds really obvious, but we as artists, put far too much pressure on ourselves throughout the drawing process, and we end up making things usually more complicated than they need to be. Focus on what's closest to the skin, work up from there, do it in a few 1 or 2 square inches at a time, and then here, as you can see, it all starts to come together. Now, another tip, if you are working on something complex and you start to feel overwhelmed, just take a step back from your easel. I did this drawing over the space of 5 or 6 days. I wouldn't want to complete this and try and force it finished within 2 days, because it just wouldn't, it wouldn't work out in the same way. It wouldn't have the same degree of realism. So allow that time. Put it away if you need to for a day or 2. Look at it with fresh eyes, and then these feathers will become far less overwhelming. Now, one thing that I would want to mention is, in my Patreon tutorials, whenever I make a mistake, I always leave those elements in the tutorial. We all make mistakes, it's part of the process, it's natural, but I want to make sure that I include how to fix those mistakes, so that if anybody following along on Patreon does also do that, not just maybe with this tutorial, but something else that they're working on, they know how to fix it. Now, what I'm going to be doing in a moment is darkening up the feathers on the left hand side of the beak, so here. The reason being, I felt like I didn't have enough contrast on this side of the face. So my light source is coming across from my right hand side, therefore the left hand side of the face has to be slightly darker to show the viewer what that light source is doing. So I didn't feel like I had my base layer dark enough. It's far easier to sometimes think, oh, well, it's okay, I can just leave that as it is. I don't want to draw over those details. But if I hadn't have done that and I didn't darken up those base layers, that one part of the face just wouldn't have looked right. So again, it's one of those things, if you notice that something isn't right, go ahead and make those alterations. So for the feathers here around the face, this required a completely different technique. I am using a range of pencils. I'm focusing still on my base layers. They're really, really important. If you've seen my other videos on YouTube, you'll know I put so much emphasis on the base layer stage because it makes it so much easier to build our details. But for this, as you can see, the feathers, they're a completely different shape. They're a completely different texture. Therefore, I needed to approach these in a slightly different way. Now, this was the first time that I had drawn a barn out in pastels, so I was also learning with what techniques I wanted to use to get the most out of this type of texture. And I soon found the way that I progressed round the side of the face, I found the way that I wanted to use those pencils to achieve the type of texture that I wanted. The feathers, they also change shape as they get round to the side of the face, so these are all little details that we need to pay attention to at the time of drawing. You'll then notice, once I was happy with how I've created those feathers, I then overlap the white feathers from the face over the top of my semicircle feathers. Now, this is really important. It's something, again, that I speak a lot about in YouTube videos and also on Patreon. When you've got any element that is behind something else, it's really important to draw that part first so that you can then overlap your details of the element that's sitting in front. That's just going to help to build more 3D and more shape and form to your portrait. Now, when we're drawing any elements like this where it does become a little repetitive and we start to notice some of the shapes are very similar, we sort of, without even realising, start to draw everything looking symmetrical. So some of these semicircular feathers might accidentally start to be drawn in rows, and we might all start to make them the same shape. Now, this is something throughout the real-time footage where I had to keep on making sure that I would really stagger those feathers to make sure that I avoided that symmetrical look. So when you're working on anything, regardless if it's tiger stripes, leopard spots, anything like that, you really don't want to have anything that's looking too uniform and too symmetrical. One of the main reasons why I chose this reference photo for the Patreon tutorial is because it had various elements that were out of focus, and this requires a different blending technique, something very different to what we've done on the face. So again, this tutorial, I could cover a lot in one subject. You'll notice that I'm keeping all of my lines here really soft, particularly on the edges that overlap the background. I don't want there to be any really harsh edges because I'm going to make it look like then the body's in focus. The reference photo for this is absolutely stunning. I really did like it. It was one of my favourite portraits to work on, and I really did want to focus on the different textures here. But again, regardless of whether or not it's out of focus or highly detailed, I still put so much focus on those base layer stages. I make sure I've got my nice pigment with those yellow ochre and burnt sienna values down first. I'm putting my darker greys in, and then you'll see that I'm starting to build up that speckle appearance within the wings. Now each feather is going to be very unique and very different from whatever is next to it, so do study one feather at a time. Look at these as abstract shapes. Don't think of them as individual feathers. Just, if you have to, turn your artwork upside down and your reference photo upside down, and that will help to force your brain to see them as shapes rather than feathers. Also, when I was working on this part of the portrait, I regularly stepped back from my easel and looked at it from a distance, because on this, when I was working on it at the time, the wing, it felt like it was missing something, but that was only because I'd been working on so much detail on the face. I felt like I should have been adding more detail to the wing, which would not have created the depth that I wanted here. Keep taking a step back from your easel and thinking, you know, now that I've got all of that detail on the face and it's really in focus, that's making this body and the wing so much softer and out of focus, which is exactly what I wanted. Once I was happy with what I built up on the wing, I then progressed over to the rest of the chest. Now this here, again, is one of those things where you don't want anything too symmetrical. These speckled little markings on the body, they have to be random, but they do follow a general shape and the way that the chest curves over underneath where the throat would be. And the last thing that I had to do to this portrait is add those smaller semicircular feathers on the left hand side of the face. I then take a step back again from my easel and see if there are any final details that I have to add. One of those details was adding the snow that should be sitting in front of the bar now. So I'm using a white pencil to do that, but for the snow that I used on the background, I did use a stencil, and all of that process is shown in part 1 on my Patreon channel. So here is a photograph of my finished bar now. I really hope the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video are useful. If they were, I'd really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up, because it really does help. And if you'd like to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, pop them in the comments below. I am more than happy to help if I can. And as always, thank you so much for watching.